eternal law is here set in opposition to the written law, and that exactly the same occurs in the context of the Gospel of St. Matthew, where the eternal law is expressed by the words, the law or the prophets. The history of the different renderings of this text, verses 17 to 18, is very curious. In most of the transcripts, the word law is not followed by the words and the prophets. In this case, there can be no doubt of it signifying the eternal law. In other transcripts, as for instance in those of Tischendorf and the canonical transcripts, the word prophets is added, not with the conjunction and, but with the disjunctive or, the law or the prophets, which likewise excludes the meaning of the written law and confirms that of the eternal law. In some transcripts again, which are not adopted by the Church, we find the word prophets preceded by the conjunction and not by or. In these transcripts, after the repetition of the word law, the words and the prophets are again added. Thus the meaning given to the whole saying by this remodeling is that Christ's words refer only to the written law. These variations give us the history of the various interpretations to which this passage has been subjected. One point is obvious. Christ speaks here, as he does in the Gospel according to St. Luke, of the eternal law. But we find men among the transcribers of the Gospels who have added the words and the prophets to the word law, with the design of rendering the Mosaic law obligatory, and have thus altered the sense of the text. Other Christians, again, who reject the Mosaic law, either leave out the word completely, or substitute the word or for the word kai, and thus the passage enters the canon with the disjunctive or. Yet though the text adopted by the canon is so indubitably clear, our canonical commentators continue to expound on the passage in the spirit of the alterations that have not been adopted. Countless commentators have treated this passage, and as the expounder agrees less with the simple, direct sense of the doctrine of Christ, the further his commentary must necessarily be from the true sense of that doctrine. The majority of expounders retain the apocryphal sense, which the text rejects. In order to be convinced that Christ speaks in this verse only of the eternal law, it will suffice to fully understand the word that has given rise to these false interpretations. In Russian, it is zakon, law; in Greek, nomos; in Hebrew, Torah. This word has two principal meanings in the Russian, Greek, and Hebrew languages. The one, the unexpressed, unwritten law; the other, the written expression of what certain men call the law. Indeed, the difference exists in all languages. In Greek, in the epistles of Paul, the difference is sometimes marked by the use of the article. In speaking of the written law, the apostle omits the article before the word law, and when he speaks of the eternal law, the article is prefixed. The ancient Hebrews, the prophets, and Isaiah always use the word Torah, the law, to indicate the eternal, unwritten but revealed law of God. This same word, Torah, the law, was first used by Ezra, and later we find it in the Talmud, as signifying the 5 books of Moses, which bear the general title of Torah, in the same sense as our word Bible, with this difference, however, that we distinguish the Bible from the law of God by 2 different denominations, while in the Hebrew language there is but one word for both. Therefore Christ, using the word Torah, takes it in the 2 different accepted meanings of the word, either confirming it, as Isaiah and the other prophets do, in the sense of the law of God, which is eternal, or rejecting it, when he refers to the Mosaic law. But in order to make a distinction between the different meanings of the word, he always adds, "and the prophets," and the pronoun "your," in speaking of the written law. When Christ says, "As you would want men to treat you, also treat them likewise," this is the whole law and the prophets. He refers to the written law. He tells us that the whole written law may be reduced to this sole expression of the eternal law. And by these his words, he annuls the written law. When he says, in Luke 16, verse 16, "the law and the prophets until John the Baptist," he refers to the written law, and by these words asserts that it is no longer obligatory. When he says, in John 7:19, "Didn't Moses give you the law? And yet none of you keeps the law." Or John 8:17, "Isn't it said in your law?" Or again John 15:25, "The word that is written in their law." He refers to the written law, the law that he rejects, the law by which he was soon after sentenced to death. John 19, verse 7, "The Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and by our law he ought to die.'" It is obvious that this law of the Hebrews, by which Christ himself was sentenced to death, was not the law that he taught. But when Christ says, "I come not to destroy the law, but to teach you to fulfill it, for nothing can be altered in the law, but all must be fulfilled," he does not speak of the written law, but of the divine, eternal law. It may be said that these proofs are controvertible, that I have skillfully assorted the contexts, and have carefully concealed all that could contradict my interpretation, that the commentaries given by the Church are very clear and convincing, and that Christ did not destroy the law of Moses, but that he left it in full force. Let us suppose that this be the case. What, then, does Christ teach? According to the commentaries of the Church, he taught men that he was the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God the Father, and that he had come down from heaven to redeem mankind from the sin of Adam. But whoever has read the Gospel knows that Christ says nothing of this, or at least alludes to it in very ambiguous terms. The passages in which Christ speaks of himself as being the second person of the Trinity, and of his redeeming mankind, are the shortest and least perspicuous in the Gospels. In what, then, does the rest of Christ's teaching consist? It is impossible to deny what all Christians have always acknowledged, that the main point in Christ's doctrine consists in his rules of life, how men are to live together. Now, if we admit that Christ taught a new system of life, we must form some definite idea of the men among whom he taught. Take, for instance, the Russians, the English, the Chinese, the Hindus, or even any wild insular tribe, and you will be sure to find that they all have their own rules of life, their own laws, and that no teacher could introduce new laws of life without destroying the former ones. He could not teach without infringing them. Such would be the case everywhere. The teacher would inevitably have to begin by destroying our laws, which have grown precious and almost sacred in our eyes. Perhaps in our days it might happen that the teacher of a new doctrine of life would only destroy our civil laws, our government, and our customs, without interfering with the laws that we call divine, though this is hardly probable. But the Hebrews had only one law, a divine law that embraced life in its minutest details. What could a preacher teach them if he began by declaring that the